I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening. I have a bunch of news before we get to the show proper, which is a little bit of an odd one this week. Brian is on the podcast again, and we accidentally got political again. But I think it's a fun conversation. First, though, I want to make a couple of announcements. I am going to be at the Newburyport Literary Festival coming up next week, April 29th, which is a Saturday. I'm going to be in the Newburyport Public Library all day long. There are poetry readings and panels in the library. I'm going to be reading that afternoon with Alan Shapiro. It's a great lineup for the festival. Alan Shapiro is going to be there. Aaron Pachigian, Andrew Hudgens, and Amit Majmudar will all be there, along with a whole lot of other people, including Zara, regular listener and correspondent, and one of the organizers of the festival. So, Alfred and Nicole, too. So a lot of A's. It should be good. Alan's just like one of the most entertaining reader talkers that I have, that I've heard. So I know that will be a lot of fun, and I imagine the rest will be as well. I know all those guys at least a little bit. Never met Amit in person, but I am looking forward to it. So again, that's the Newburyport Literary Festival in Newburyport, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. If you are in the area, my sense of New England states is they may as well be in Narnia. I have no idea how any of these are oriented or how big they are relative to one another. But if you are in the area of an hour-ish north of Boston, next week, the 29th of April. There's other stuff going on all weekend but the 29th is Poetry Day in Newburyport. So I look forward to seeing Amit, Alan, Aaron, Alfred. I don't know Alfred. He's wrote into the show once, but I don't know him otherwise. And Andrew and Zara and everybody else. So Shane McCrae, the longtime faithful bad conscience of SLEERICKETS, frequent correspondent, an excellent poet as well. So we have talked about him and responded to him. Finally, after many listener requests, Shane is going to be on the show. I'm really looking forward to that, and I have already put to the Substack chat a call for questions. I have some things I'd like to ask Shane, but I know enough people have requested that I try to get him on the show that I wanted to give all of you a chance to ask your own questions. So do write in sleerickets@gmail.com if you have any idea, anything you would really like to hear Shane talk about or yell at me about or us argue about. Just let me know. Again, at sleerickets@gmail.com, or better yet, go to sleerickets.substack.com, sign up for the secret show, and you can join the Substack chat too, because I have it's active, it's interesting. People argue on there, talk about poetry, talk about music, any number of other things. One regular participant did observe recently that the Substack chat is heavily populated by bearded, brown-haired white men who are into heavy metal. Certainly not everyone on there, but a disproportionate number of the people participating in the Substack chat are fit this description. I am thankfully providing a little bit of diversity in the form of a guy who is not really into heavy metal particularly. But if you would, please, everybody is welcome. You are also welcome to lurk, but you are especially welcome to come participate. And I believe if you just go to the Substack page, sleerickets.substack.com, I think you should be able to join up. It's on Android and iPhone now, and it also is on, you can just do it on your desktop or your laptop. So I think you can join up even without being a paid subscriber. Give it a shot. If you have any questions about that, let me know, and I will try to puzzle through it with you. I believe it is fairly intuitive, however. So I think this is a fun conversation. Brian and I got into some messy, interesting questions. As I said, this is not a political podcast. It's not a culture war podcast. We do tiptoe, or rather, we do slide on our asses into that territory a little bit this week. The other half of this conversation, actually the first half of this conversation, completely unplanned, got real strange and personal and very much about writing and the writing life. But I still haven't edited it entirely yet, but I definitely didn't feel entirely at ease putting it on the main feed. So I am going to release that on the Secret Show, along with the other part of my conversation with Cameron, which is also quite juicy. There is, in addition to that, a new solo show up, or newish solo show up there now, about a few things, including a recent feud among a couple of other poetry podcasts. It's all pretty scintillating, and you can give it a try. If you just go to sleerickets.substack.com, put in your email address, and I'll give you a week's access for free. So some people have been taking advantage of that offer recently. I encourage you to do the same. And with that, I think we can get to this week's possibly regrettable but enjoyable conversation with Brian Platzer. Yeah. All right.
So I read this article in the New York Times, and I had a funny reaction to it. So I read this article in the New York Times, and the headline is, "As classic novels get revised for today's readers, a debate about where to draw the line." And listeners to this podcast will be familiar with the argument. Yeah. The subhead here is Agatha Christie, period, Roald Dahl, period, Ian Fleming, period. Classics are being reworked to remove offensive language, but some readers wonder, where does the posthumous editing go too far? So I'm not going to go too deep into the details, but as many of you know, and all of you can imagine, books that were written in the past have some racist and misogynist stuff in them. So publishers, homophobia and anti-Semitic, all sorts of bigoted. They have some either purposeful or accidental bigotry in the work. And I read the article, and there were two basic sides of the article as presented in the New York Times. The side that the objective writers Alexandra Alter and Elizabeth Harris come down on, which is that this is kind of fucked up. Like, we're changing the, words of writers who are dead. And when we did this when they were living, that was one thing, and they checked in on it and they were okay with it. But now that Netflix bought the Roald Dahl story company for $1 billion, Netflix is partially in charge of putting out the books. Yeah. And everybody's sort of getting together saying, some of this stuff where Roald Dahl calls people like fat and ugly and Oompa Loompas, are these like gross boys or chunky girls, or they used to be.
That was his revised.
That was his edit, right? They used to be kidnapped pygmies from Africa. Like he was literally. I mean, he was a proper anti-Semite.
That's what they were in my original.
Is that true?
Like the version I read when I was a kid, I think was like the kidnapped pygmies version. I'm going to grab my sweater.
Right. And then, even at the time, people are like, Roald, man, like you can't. This isn't working. Like you can't do this. And he's like, all right, I'm just going to copy, Apple F, Apple R, or whatever the replace is, and like get rid of all the pygmies and just change the word to Oompa Loompas. And otherwise it's the same story, but they're Oompa Loompas, which are pretend. And that was the original change, but now Roald Dahl's dead and people want to make more changes because he refers to Augustus Gloop as fat. And there are some overweight kids.
He doesn't just refer to him as fat, like in a way, like the whole concept
the whole
of
point
Augustus
of him
Gloop
is he's like
a
a
little fat kid
out
who
of
eats too
control,
much
fat
sugar.
eating fatso.
It's
Right,
hard to
exactly.
convey him as a character at all without that.
Right.
Yeah.
So they have to do these sort of too cute by half replacements where, I think in the new version he's enormous instead of fat. And theoretically, he could be like a big alpha jock eating guy instead of like can't control his hunger,
wants to like scarf down
indulgent guy, right?
the Quito River of
Exactly of beef and nuts.
Bone
That's all
broth.
he's able to eat. Augustus Goop. So there's this article about how and then the quotations that show up over and over and over about these issues come from once in a while Philip Pullman, but always Salman Rushdie, who really has a moral leg to stand on here, right? Because he was like stabbed in the face for writing stuff he wasn't supposed to write and doesn't believe in censorship. So he calls these edits absurd censorship. And then he tweeted something like the Dahl estate should be ashamed of itself. And that's the side that the article comes down on. The article also mentions, because it's, both sidesing it, I think somewhat appropriately, quotes a team, a sensitivity editor who says, I think it's a good practice, the way that you update textbooks. I think that why should we show kids, like racist depictions when we can just get rid of the racist depictions? So I read the article and I thought like, I don't quite know what I think about this. I know that anybody I've heard talks about this comes down strongly on the side of editing writers after they are dead is fucked up and wrong. Like anybody who, like my former high school teachers who complain about this, or, my strong-willed writing friends, they believe that this is insane. And the danger, the sort of slippery slope argument is what comes up the most, where like you might agree with the folks now who are doing this, but who knows who's going to change it later. And they say, and how dare you complain that people are removing Toni Morrison books from libraries on one hand and not complain about people editing the Roald Dahl books or the Ian Fleming books on the other. It's just the opposite sides of an identical coin. But I thought like that seemed too simplistic. I don't quite, there must be something I'm missing. So I do what I do sometimes. And the readers' picks section of the comments on the New York Times articles are actually pretty good. You have thousands of people respond to many New York Times articles and readers upvote them or reply to them. And I'm reading the comments, and 1,200 people have commented on this article. And these are all, again, maybe you hate liberal asshole, left-leaning New Yorkers. They're
going to skew more educated. They're going to skew.
Right, but these are people who subscribe to the New York Times and are taking the time. And the comment sections really are better than social media comment sections. Whether these people are obnoxious and you loathe them or not, these are like, they're not just like fits of rage comments. These are people who at least think they're being thoughtful, whether or not they are. And I read through them, and these are the most recommended. So Michael's comment from Maine, Michael from Maine, and 1,341 people, so over 1,000 people recommended this comment. Censorship from the left is just as bad as censorship from the right. Keep texts as they are. Number two, this is 1,017 people recommended it. The problem with censorship is always a question of who gets to decide, leave books as they are. Number three, almost 1,000 people. Well, I do feel the current use of many terms inappropriate. Scrubbing prior work seems awfully akin to trying to change the past. Over and over and over and over. The first 50 comments all say some version of the same thing, which is that this is morally and literarily reprehensible. And I was taken aback by that, because I felt like, I don't know, that the people making these changes aren't idiots. They're for the most part making these changes out of what they see to be kindness. I think they think they're doing this out of kindness. Now, the one caveat to the kindness is the mercenary aspect of it, and I don't want to underplay that. So what they would say is kindness, and I don't want the fat kid needing to read about how fatness is bad. I don't know whether to believe them or not, because they want to sell books by Roald Dahl. And after Netflix puts $1 billion into this, whoever's publishing books by Roald Dahl at the point want to keep on publishing books by Roald Dahl. So they don't want to be in a position where they're trying to sell books to children who are overweight, and the parents are like, this is fucked up. Like, I'm trying to tell my kid that we love him for who he is, and then he's reading a book where somebody's mocked for being overweight. Like, why can't you just get rid of that one part and you'd still sell the book? So clearly these are mercenary instincts. But when I read books to my kids, I edit them sometimes, or edited before they're reading themselves. So sometimes if I was reading fairy tales, I've got these books that were read to me when I was a kid about, stories that you're all familiar with. I'm not going to rehash, but like, if a princess is described as petite and beautiful and charming, and I know that she's going to be the object of affection later on, I have swapped that out for smart and hardworking. Like, I have changed some of those details, not always, not because I'm like obsessed with it, but if I'm reading and like, everything good about this girl is that like she's wearing pink, you're actively spitting at the microphone. So maybe I'm performing some cliche that like I didn't realize I was. But like, I'm reading my boys this book about how there's like a strong woodsman man and this like little girl who needs help, but her lips are plump and her body is svelte. Like, I'm going to change it to make her desirability conform with what I want my kids to see in desirability.
I can't. I mean, I am laughing because I do find that to be hilarious. I can't throw the first stone entirely, because I will say where I have done that typically is in places where it's like, and then the two adventurers saw the group of travelers and they had horrible dark skin and they looked evil. And it was like, so like, I will like drop like dark, like I'll drop the dark and stuff like that. There are places where it's like, oh, this is just like pure, like instinctive racism being expressed. Like I will drop those when I'm reading them aloud. I also, though I don't, like my daughter has read all of the Chronicles of Narnia almost entirely on her own. Like when I mentioned her, I was like, well, sometimes in old books, there are things people say that, like felt normal to them, but actually they bother some people now. And she's like, oh yeah, like she did the thing I did as a kid, which is like, she recognized that, saw that, she goes to a school where she gets like tons of social justice brainwashing in the way that is probably good for her. Like she recognizes that and she sees what it is and she like does the math in her own head. So that,
yes. And that is key to me. And I would never want to change books that adults are reading and try to, I mean, there is a difference between banning literature and changing parts of literature that kids are not yet ready to have the meta conversation about. And that's where I am. Like, I don't think, for 20 minutes, a couple high school classes read the version of Huck Finn where instead of using the N-word, they could use the word slave in it, which like didn't really make any sense because Huck was always like saying friend like Jim, like you slave or like slaves, they don't, and like they weren't slaves. Some of the people, it's just like it just didn't really work. That seems crazy. Anybody who's
Huck Finn is also like a book you can read as an adult,
right?
It's not like
Right. And I am not at all saying that books read by adults or for historians or anything should be changed. Table that for a second because I do want to follow down the adult path for a second. But first I want to talk about kids. So for kids, I am comfortable saying that instead of reading a Dr. Seuss book where like all the Asian characters have bright yellow skin and crazy hats and are carrying white people on their backs who are holding guns and forcing them what to do. Like, you should read a different Dr. Seuss book. Like, I'm sort of okay banning that book. And I don't
banning. I mean, what does banning mean? Because those books weren't banned; they were just discontinued by the state, right?
Right.
That's not banning in quite the same way.
No, people should have access to them if they want to seek them out.
Right.
But if a library is going to have 11 books by Dr. Seuss, I don't see why one of the 11 should be the yellow-faced Chinese
Yeah,
guy holding
that's
up white
judgment. That's
people.
like what
Right,
used to be
exactly.
called, in a neutral sense, having discrimination, right? Like,
Exactly. So I forgive me because I could see how maybe an iconoclast would use the word I am fine banning that book
sure,
sincerely. I am
sure,
not
yeah,
fine banning no book. All books should have people should have access to all books. People should be able to read Mein Kampf if they want and all the
yeah,
other
yeah,
terrible things ever written. But we're talking about selectivity. And if you're going to select a series of books for kids to read, Dr. Seuss wrote some wonderful books. I don't see why you would read the book that
sure,
shows
yeah, yeah,
Chinese
yeah,
people as like slavish animal men. Like it just doesn't make sense to me.
yeah,
I do think though that then that sort of internalization of Asian people as weird is something that I had growing up, and my parents wouldn't have said anything out loud to me about. They wouldn't have said like, the things about Asian people is they're different from us, but
right,
somehow through watching the cartoons I watched and reading the books I read, and I thought Asian people were different. And like that sucks. And I
yeah,
wish I didn't. And I think it's fair to change some of these cultural totems if they're disparaging groups or types of people. That being
yeah,
said, I believe that getting in when kids are capable of the meta conversation, like the one that you had with your daughter, that is better. Like it's
yeah,
better for your daughter to have access to books that are what could be described as problematic and having a conversation about the problematic nature of those books. And then
sure,
it's even better when your daughter gets older to have a conversation, to read Kipling or whatever the equivalent is, and to
right.
say like the reason why we're reading this is to get a perspective of a white man's vision of India. Like that is both sort of
Well, I mean but that's also
literarily.
like, but that's also not the only reason you're reading, because like Kipling was also a
Exactly.
really good writer.
It's
Like he
right.
was a
So the
good
things
writer
are
who also was
literally of
racist, and
merit, right?
yeah,
And what's interesting about
yeah,
Conrad or Kipling or is the books are really good
yeah,
and they're super racist,
right, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
you should be able to have both conversations. And like
yeah.
as you reach different levels of maturity, I think that they should be available to all. But does the fact that a company is making money off of it necessarily make it wrong? No. And I'm about to stop my monologue,
Mhm.
and I would love to hear you poke holes in everything I'm saying. The place that I get the most confused about is Ian Fleming.
Hmm.
So those books, Bond books, are primarily read by older teenagers and adults
Okay.
still,
Yeah.
or
I never
younger
read any
teenagers,
of them. Yeah, I
but
never read
neither
them.
have
Yeah.
I. And most of what was removed or changed of those books is use of the N word, which Fleming used a lot of times.
I
And
didn't think that was even like, I didn't think Brits even used that much, but maybe I'm wrong.
yeah, I don't, I mean, I'll get
They
there.
don't. Only Ian Fleming.
Only
Like,
Ian Fleming brought it to
a
England.
special
Yeah,
passion for it. Yeah.
exactly. He had a thing for he felt it was the perfect word. But then also, some of his Asian and dark skinned characters were ridiculous.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
the
The
big.
women were very true to life and very richly developed.
Exactly. Well, that was I was going to say. The problem is
Yeah.
this is a book about a spy who thinks England
Like a
should
super
have
sex guy who
supremacy
like murders
over all
people
the
all the
other
time.
countries, who
Right, yeah.
essentially rapes women until they like it.
Right.
So like
Or get murdered by the people who hired them to kill
right.
him, and then which
It,
they then failed because they were having sex
right.
with him. Yeah.
So these books are the idea of making relatively minor changes to James Bond
Right.
strikes me as absurd.
Right.
But
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but then again, if you're going to reprint James Bond, I don't know. Why would you put the N word in it? Like, I guess the answer is because the depictions are so racist anyway that the
They don't
fact
need the
that
extra boost. They don't
I don't
like,
know, right? Like, this
yeah.
is where I get sincerely confused. And this is where I need help figuring out what I think.
Right.
Because, like, Ian Fleming, like, I don't care what they do to the James Bond books.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Salman Rushdie seems to, if you take away the N word, but still all of the characters of color are like muscle bound idiots. Like, is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
better? I honestly don't know. But that's my pitch. And where
Yeah.
do you agree? Where do you disagree? Where do you share my confusion?
I mean, yeah. So I do have some ambivalence about this. Like, definitely, I am with all of your high school teachers and writer friends in that my immediate and very strong instinct is don't edit books in the posthumously. Don't like, come on, don't do that. I will, like, a slight distinction I will make is that I realize I have pretty different feelings. Like the reason I will like cringe and edit books slightly, I definitely won't like rewrite them to the extent that you will to make them like have a good message, or like I will like, and like when there's a book that's like all about like, oh, it was so good that she was so pretty and that was what made her value, like I won't edit those, I will comment on them. And that's the thing, is like when I will remove things like the evil dark, like when I'll take dark skinned out of a description or something, it is that there's actually, I think, a really significant difference between allowing my daughter to read a book on her own and encounter a bunch of different weird stuff in it that she has to think about, and reading something aloud to her and not commenting on it.
Agreed.
Right.
Agreed.
And so like that's where I think, particularly with my older daughter who can read on her own and is like, it's ferocious as a reader, and it like has some pretty good critical thinking skills. Like if I read it to her and say nothing, then that is actually doing something different than just letting her read it on her own. So
right, that's somehow putting your stamp of approval on it.
Yeah, I mean, but I do the same thing with like some of the stuff. Like I will do that with all sorts of things she reads, not all of which are racist or sexist. Some of which are like, well, in school they taught us that growth mindset is good and fixed mindset is bad, and like that's an incredibly like childish way to think about thinking.
Yes.
Like there are about 40 different ways I can think that that's stupid and wrong. Like let's talk about that.
Totally. And I also, I'm looking back at a time then when my kids were younger also, where I wouldn't, now I wouldn't just like change adjectives for the sake of their development. I would like, we're reading, I'm reading out loud a Matt Christopher book to my younger son. I read
he's
like 1,000 of these.
Sports guy.
Yeah. He's written like whatever, 800 sports books, and they're all called like The Kid with the Lucky Baseball Bat, you know, the different versions now. And I do take a moment and say like, it's kind of weird. Like, what do you think that about all the kids in the playing sports being, and then fill in the blank, whatever they are, like whether it's white, you know, it's like, is it, what do you like when you see this picture, like what do you, and usually he's like, they're all wearing two shoes. Sometimes in my life, people take off their shoes,
right?
You know, and I'm like, that's fine. Like, yes, it's weird that they're all wearing two shoes, but I do try to introduce the conversation that like, why is it that the girls are all just talking about how cute the boys are and the boys are interested in baseball? And like, this is a thing where people used to talk about girls and now we don't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. And again, maybe your listeners are going to think I'm some like liberal cuck who's ruining my son's sense of masculinity in saying this. But
there is some truth to like girls tend to get interested in sex slightly before boys are even aware. Like there is some like difference in just speed of development, right? Like,
totally. And I think that that's a conversation that I have with my kids also, but I interrupted. So you were saying you feel like you are giving an implicit stamp of approval on a text if you don't jump in and at least discuss it if something seems odd, if you are involved in the process of reading.
Right. And if I basically like when I do make us, and it tend to be like, it will be an extremely small edit and I will usually just like remove or slightly alter one word. And it is typically for like explicitly racist stuff. Like that's typically when I'll jump in, or just like weird stuff about like people with disabilities. Like there's like certain weird language in like Grimm's fairy tales or stuff like that. But the times when I do that, part of the reason I cringe is that I'm doing that in lieu of having a conversation with her about it. Because
I was going to say,
I will actually read it and then talk to her about like what I might find to be troubling in it.
And we're getting off the path a little bit, but a lot of that has to do with like my energy and what time it is.
Exactly. Oh, totally. You know, it's like if I need to get them to bed, so we're just going to skip the racism for
now. If it's like 8:45, I'll just elide the racism. Where if it's like 2:15 and like we're not doing anything,
let's talk about it.
We'll discuss it. And again, that's either like good or bad parenting. But do you have a really strong instinct that when Roald Dahl made characters unattractive in, like, for example, in the Twits, Mrs. Twit, so there's these a couple, I believe, who are like cruel to children, and the children play jokes on them, I think is the main issue of that book, and that's a motif that comes up in a lot of Dahl books. But I think Mrs. Twit, I'm looking for the quotation here, she's no longer ugly and beastly in the book, she's just beastly. And to me that's like sort of strange, because I don't think a lot of kids like self-associate as ugly, so I'm not like that's a weird edit.
And like adults tend to be gross and ugly looking to kids, for like even normal attractive adults.
But I am ambivalent, because like I don't really care about that. Like, if somebody wants to sell Roald Dahl books and thinks that Ugly and Beastly might make a kid not taunt another kid saying, "Hey, you're ugly." Like, I don't know. Does it matter? Like, I don't like being too precious with this stuff where like, I don't see what the problem is, I guess, a lot of it. Like that's where I get a little confused. Like, why is this so bad? And that's where like the first, as I said, the first 50 comments in the New York Times article are all like, this is the same as fascism. And it just,
no, it's not.
It isn't the same as fascism. No. So if you can dismiss that, it's like, this is literarily or morally repugnant, which is, I think, what my high school, and I keep on saying my high school teacher, because I have like two different high school teachers who have made a big point of saying, I can't believe this is going on. And they're in their 60s or 70s or whatever. But like, why is this so bad? Like capitalist society, companies trying to make money by selling more books and selling them with tiny alterations that make them less offensive to either the readers or the parents of the readers. Like, why am I supposed to be offended by this?
I guess I break this into several different questions that are mostly kind of independent of one another, and that we pretend are all tangled up in a way that maybe they aren't necessarily. One is, and this is how I feel about like when conservatives get mad about, I haven't followed the particulars, but like I understand that a trans person was like a spokesmodel for Bud Light, and they got really mad about
Bud
that.
Light. Trans person was in the bath drinking Bud Light.
Sure. And then like, I know there's like also conservatives have had one of their like arguments has been, oh, the corporate, you go woke and you go broke and it's bad for business. And then there's like, I saw on some like, very progressive publication recently, like, aha, look at this rainbow colored graph. Actually, when you go woke, you make more money.
Right.
And my response is like, all of that is amoral. Like, I neither am mad at you for having a trans, not that I would be mad anyway, but like, neither is that a moral failing, nor is that a moral triumph. It is a business decision, and it's either a good one or a bad one, but like, this is a business trying to make money, and this is a calculation they've made that will make them more money, and maybe it will work and maybe it won't, and it's amoral either way.
But right? Let me interrupt and say that, because like, I'm sure some of what some of your listeners are thinking right now is, but what about in the reverse? Like, if you were going to say like Diet Pepsi, the drink for whites, like if that was a moral decision to try to get more white people drinking Diet Pepsi,
it's an amoral decision. It's a business decision.
Right. You would say
a repugnant business decision, but it's a business decision.
But you just said repugnant, right? So you can't say it might be amoral insofar as the people who decided to make the decision was making it without thinking about its morality, but you just called it repugnant, which is a morally loaded term. So
but I think like they're making a business decision, and I think like the problem is, I actually think it's pretty difficult to disentangle the repugnance of Diet Pepsi, the drink for whites, and saying, and like the problem is that it would be so much not a good business decision. Like, that would be a desperately terrible business decision, and I think like it's not a coincidence that like we find that morally repugnant and it would be bad for their business. But I think it's like, it's a little bit hard to, I think like fundamentally, it's a pretty amoral decision. Like, fundamentally, I think businesses are genderless, soulless machines trying to make as much money as possible. And like,
I completely agree.
Like norms and mores, contribute to how people make their, consumption decisions.
Right. There are, I think, roads we could travel about counterexamples where people like hypersexualized straight masculine beer drinking. Was that similarly amoral? Was it also repugnant? Maybe, I'm not sure, but that's.
I think, to some extent, I think like not as much at the time as it would be now.
Right. So my question is, what about literarily? Because I think that a lot of these
literarily,
So I think a lot of, again, to use my high school English teacher as a stand-in for the people who are outraged by this, I think that they would use less a vocabulary of morality than one of artistic integrity. Like, how dare anybody touch the work of a dead artist? Like, this is a work of art. changing it posthumously is against our job as stewards of the arts. Or, I mean, I don't really consider myself a steward of the arts. So I'm trying to find words that aren't I'm trying not to create a straw man. I'm trying to actually strong man their argument, which is like, so what is it? It's like art has intrinsic value, and to have like a bunch of salespeople poke around in art is fucked up, right? Like that's what they would say. My reaction is like, I don't care that much. But why do you have that? I think you share their reaction a little bit more than I do.
I share it as an intuition. I share it as a feeling that's a trained feeling. It's not purely an instinct, but like it's not, I don't know that, I think like it is significant that it makes a lot of sense that Roald Dahl is somebody we talk about in this case, because I think it's like, he may be the case in which there's the sharpest intersection between an opportunity for extremely wide commercial like appeal to children and like some legitimate claim to artistic worth. And I think like that's a little bit less the case with Agatha Christie. It's a little bit less the case with Ian Fleming. It's a little bit less the case with some of these other cases. I think like
Dr. Seuss.
I mean, I think Dr. Seuss is like at a much lower reading level, obviously, like also has some real, I'll tell you what horrified me even more than not, you know, I mean, I'm not, especially the thing about Dr. Seuss is like, he was great. And there's so many of these that are great, but it's not like any one of them is so amazing in its own right. It's more like he put out an amazing amount of like remarkably good small children's literature, and like losing 5 of them, it's like, who cares?
Totally.
But you know what they do, what the Seuss estate has also approved is you can buy Dr. Seuss books that look 100% like Dr. Seuss books, like very, very close, like closely imitated artwork, totally the same presentation, same font, same Cat in the Hat stamp, everything, written by other people, completely new books.
Right.
And they are garbage. They are like,
interesting.
My daughter's got one called 1 cent, 2 cents, old cent, new cent. And it's a tour through the Museum of Money. And it's like, not only is like the meter very bad and the rhyme is bad, but it's like brutally boring, didactic, like rhymes about the history of money and how you need to be good at saving money. And it's just horrible. And like, it's not, they don't say it's by Dr. Seuss, but like everything except for the tiny little words at the bottom saying the author's names says it's by Dr. Seuss. And like, that's awful.
So the existence of that, again, sort of puts me in so who gives a shit anyway? So like, if we're going to take away, you know, fad and make it large, or if we're going to take away I just don't know. Like,
I mean, so they're like, again, like there's several different considerations. Like this is where like, I think mostly I just say, I have no, like these choices get zero moral credit because they're 100% business decisions. Like the company's doing this, Netflix like the reason Netflix cares about this is that it bought the rights and it's trying to put out a bunch of content. And so it cares to do this because it wants to make more money. Like that's where like, there's no, like, you get no moral credit for making this easier for some kids to access. Like the argument that I think like one argument you could make that would be like, I think a pretty reasonable one is like, sure, a lot of these books are not as accessible to people who, like, if you are someone who would feel implicated by one of these perilous terms, or in some cases like active slurs, then like it's going to be harder for you as a kid to read this book and enjoy it. And so maybe this book is less accessible to you. But then I think like, guess what? There are lots of other books. And like nobody's doing this about Mercer Mayer, because Mercer Mayer's books are trash and everybody knows that.
Totally. And I think that's a super compelling argument, saying like, there are
the
enough
only reason
books.
They're hanging on to this is because it's existing IP that they can market. Like that's why they're clinging to this and trying to make it more marketable.
I agree with that. And I don't know anybody who's in defense. Like, I guess the poles of the argument, insofar as I've set them up, is like artistically immoral, or artistically and or morally reprehensible, versus like, that's just sort of the way things are. Like, I don't know if anybody is like this is great, except you do have what's the name of the reader? Not the diversity reader, the sensitivity readers, which again, people are.
I have strong feelings about that. Yeah.
People love being furious about sensitivity readers. Are you one of those people who love being furious about sensitivity readers?
I don't love being furious. I find it to be like, all right, so very briefly, my high school did a DEI initiative where they paid this company for 2 years to do this top to bottom assessment. And like, there are some legitimate complaints that came up and legitimate reasons they went into all this. What I did find infuriating was they sent out like a very glossy pamphlet to all of their alums listing the conclusions and their like action plan.
Yep.
And it was a 17-point action plan. 7 to 10 of those items, including the first 4 on the list, like the first 2 pages of their pamphlet, were all hire more administrators. Almost all the rest were create new mandatory training and or paperwork for existing faculty administrators. And then the 2, which to my mind could have been the entire list, were dedicate money to scholarships and recruiting funds for non-white students, right, and hire more non-white faculty. Right. Like, so that to me could have been the whole list, and that would have been a good thing. Yeah. Like, I do think there's just like, we don't need more administrators. We don't, like, if you hire a sensitivity reader, in 0 cases out of 1,000 is a sensitivity reader going to say, oh, actually, this looks pretty good.
Totally. But I also feel like I also feel like a sensitivity reader, it's just a product of a system defined by outrage and like lawsuits. Like it's not like nobody thinks the sensitivity reader is a good idea. It's just a job that has been created, so publishing houses have an added a layer of protection. And like that's the
I think like, so that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't love to get mad about it, but like when I hear people talk about it being good, I think no, it's not. It's useless, right, and maybe slightly actively bad.
I agree with that. I just don't think that sensitivity readers are preventing lots of major works of literature from being read or published.
No, like I think it's.
I think that they're there to like, hey, do you mind giving a read to this? Like, see if anybody would be offended. And they say like, actually, maybe you might offend a trans person on page 28. Are you doing that intentionally? And it's like, no, I guess not. I'll change that a little bit. And like, that just seems fine to me. Again, like
what is the difference from a business perspective, from like a top down corporate perspective? Because you're like, this is an ass covering gesture, right?
Yes.
So what is the difference between that ass covering gesture and the ass covering gesture of saying like, oh, Simon & Schuster is putting out this new book about a race riot in Brooklyn. Why don't we get a strident, writer about racism who does a hot take blog to take it on for our major book review page, which is what happened to you. Like,
right. Well,
are those the same thing effectively?
Well, no, one is defensive and one is offensive. Like I feel like
from their perspective, I don't know if it is that different.
But I feel like if Simon & Schuster had hired that guy instead of the New York Times hiring that guy, I probably would have made 4 little changes and saved myself a whole lot of headaches.
I think if Simon & Schuster had hired a sensitivity reader for you, and then that same guy had reviewed your book, I think the result would have been almost no different.
Yeah, that's fair. He just would have found other examples.
Yeah.
Right. Because he was
doing his job. Like the sensitivity reader would have done her job, which was to find things to correct, and he would have done his job, which was to destroy the book.
Yes, that's totally fair. I feel as though the concept of a sensitivity reader is absurd on its face,
of course,
but not malevolent. Like,
no,
black people
it's not
black people are all different, so like black people
hiring like a British woman, with like African ancestry to talk about like a book about being in the South in America.
Right. Like the idea of protecting a publishing house from offending people is just sort of silly. Like it's not, but again, I don't find it offensive in the way that a lot of people do. It makes sense. Like, another way to say this, if I were starting a publishing house, I would hire a sensitivity reader, because like for that person's $50,000 salary, I would have saved myself a lot of headaches. And like, if I were publishing Roald Dahl books, I would take out all the uses of the word N-word. Like I don't, or whichever
Yeah,
one used it, the James Bond books.
Yeah.
Like to me, this is
it's
just
malpractice insurance, which is mostly not
exactly
for actually covering malpractice. It's for covering doctors who have bad personalities.
Exactly. It's malpractice insurance. And I think that some of the fury is righteous indignation as opposed to actually.
Oh yeah, that's a hobby. It's a hobby. Like people, it's a
Right.
hobby for people to get mad about woke gestures and things. Yeah.
Right. And I get in the same way that Bari Weiss just like looks all over America for examples of a professor being told that he's not allowed to like treat kids like shit, so she can write like a big article about it. It's very easy for I hate to say this about Salman Rushdie because again he was stabbed in the face for these reasons, but like it's whoever wants to be the Salman Rushdie person like can find examples where people are mistreated. And I'm just it feels.
I mean, that's totally both sides of the culture war at this point. Like finding things that are offensive, finding things that, like I mean, I think they're both mostly useless churning of content.
Right, but I do believe that it's not two sides of the same coin, and that having a sensitivity reader is like annoying and kind of dumb, whereas like banning these Toni Morrison books from libraries is probably just racism.
Yeah, those are not quite parallel though, right? Because one is like legislation and one is an individual corporate decision.
Totally. I just think that as I'm reading not only comments from the Times, but also this article in The Guardian, censorship from the left is just as bad as censorship from the right. Like that might be true, but in my reading this, censorship from the left is like kind of annoying and indicative of the problems of capitalism, where censorship of the right on the right is again equally like it doesn't come up that much, and we are cherry picking examples, and like it's like it was one library in Tennessee, so like who cares? But that does seem like something that is morally dangerous to me in a way that choosing words to edit.
I mean, like you can make I think like there are cases where like the not that this is now like a culture war podcast, but like the Dear Colleagues letter that had the big Title IX that caused the big Title IX kerfuffle, like that was actually a policy decision that did cause some real damage and was actually
I agree. There's overstepping on
and I think like part of the question is like especially on the state level, as well as at the Supreme Court level, conservatives have legislative power, liberals have cultural power, and so like that's where those are the terms of the conflict. And so I think like that, and
legislative power is more, I don't know, I was going to say is typically more
damage, has the greater potential to cause damage than cultural power does.
I think that's right.
I think that's usually true. I also think it's sort of like, I don't know that I want to give progressives any credit for causing less damage as a result, because the only reason they're causing less damage is because of the species of power they wield.
Agreed. But I also think that this article, it's titled "As Classic Novels Get Revised for Today's Readers, a debate about where to draw the line," should probably just have been market forces encourage revision of formerly uncriticized literature or something,
as well as like encourage the like endless resuscitation of existing IP rather than the creation of new content. Like we need to wring more money out of Agatha Christie is the really crucial thing here.
Totally. And people are, not my kids, but some of their friends, just because my kids happen to find it boring, but like kids are watching Curious George cartoons for no reason. Like why should there be this like white man with good posture, like getting this African animal to follow him around and do him favors, like just because of IP and how that was valuable to previous generations who want to pass it down to their kids. Like that's more valuable as opposed to the new version, Phineas and Ferb, which is hysterical and everybody can enjoy.
No, I'm this is mostly a story of amoral business driven forces. I did one other small wrinkle, because I had I can't even remember which conversation it was where we talked about, or it may have been the solo episode where I talked about like,
oh, that's so sweet. You don't see where you end and I begin.
You don't know not where I end, or like various other conversations.
Oh,
I knew it was like a core group conversation, but I think it was a
All
solo
right.
episode where I talked about like,
maybe it was Alice.
oh no, it was I think it was you and I where we talked about like making fun of different groups and how it would be nice to like, I was more on the side of it would be nice to be able to make fun of more different groups. And
that was a while ago. Yeah. No, and
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I was the
and then Matt Wall wrote in with, I think, a thoughtful distinction, which was like, well, some of these groups have people out there who actively hate them for being that group. And like,
right.
that's a slight difference. And then Elijah had, I think, and this was not on the show yet, I think he wrote this to me privately, but I think it's okay for me to say, like, he thought another maybe wrinkle to add was like, it's not necessarily just like, do people hate you for being a part of that group, but like, does being a part of this group involve or cause you suffering? Like, even if people don't, because like Cameron had said, like, well, actually, a lot of people do hate disabled people, or like did in the very recent past, or like tried to exterminate them in the Holocaust in the same way as, Jews. And even if I think like Elijah's case, and this is not to bring up the whole like controversy about whether being deaf is a disability or whatever, but if you have a condition or you belong to a group and being part of that group or having that condition involves suffering, then like it's not good form to make fun of you for being a part of that group. And I think generally speaking, that's true. And generally speaking, I think Matt's also right. I also think though that like when it comes to because I remember laughing hysteric, like it was truly the funniest thing I had ever encountered in my life when I was in first grade, and a classmate's mom came in and read the twits to us. Like it
right.
just like crying, laughing. It was so funny. And like 100% part of that funniness was like their suffering and their ugliness and their clumsiness and their bad, like
cruelty.
There was lots
right.
of like,
it was
both, yeah. I mean, and I think like, when I take my daughters to the movie theater to watch the Super Mario Brothers movie, which like, I think if you ever played the game, it's better, but none of us had ever played the game. And like, it was right. just because it was the only PG movie at the theater.
Would my kids understand it? Or
have they ever played Mario?
No.
I mean, kind of then, but like, I felt like, oh, this really wants you to have played the game and like played like all of the different Mario games.
Right. And maybe it's for the parents who have played all the different Mario games.
I think, well, like most of the audience was like nerdy adults.
Oh, that's depressing.
Well, what's interesting though? It was like
I pity those people.
Pity those people.
Oh, sorry.
They were having a great time. Like
different part of the conversation.
It was interesting. It was like a significant number of groups of non-familiar. I mean, they didn't appear to be familiar because they didn't see like, I saw they all seemed to be roughly the same age and they were in their like 20s or 30s. But they were like multiple groups that were within their groups interracial. So it was like many groups of interracial groups of nerds who all
Mario
came
Brothers
as adults
bringing us all together.
A Mario movie and had a great time. My daughters were much more confused than they were. They had a great time. But like, I took them to see this dumb movie that has no, cultural or intellectual value. And while, going there, they ate Sour Patch Kids, which is the worst candy for little kids. And it just sears all the flesh off their tongues and their mouths.
And they just want more and more and more.
They just want more and more. And so it's horrible but like part of the pleasure of being a human is like partaking in like some of these just like obviously terrible pleasure.
Of course. I think especially some of the pleasure of being a child.
Yeah. And so like, I think definitely if we're talking like morally, like certainly like we shouldn't like make fun of like actively persecuted groups because like the morally it's like it's just such a heavily weighted proposition, and like clearly you don't want to like point at somebody who's like just had his leg chopped off.
Where is this going to land?
But the place I think it's going to land is like at a certain point, like we are talking about the difference between what is moral and what is funny. And I think like it's true that like we've made a big point recently culturally in saying like we should punch up when we make fun of things. And like that's fine, that's true. But like also is just like a human being, like definitely eating a giant bag full of Reese's Pieces is not good for you, but like it feels really good. Like part of being a human is that it feels good. Like part of being a human is that like sometimes pointing at like an ugly witch woman who like trips over a stool and bonks her nose like is really funny. And like I feel like you get into a little bit of like a weird state of denial where you say like that is not fun, so I think like I think maybe my question is like my point is not like, and so let's go out and write lots of sadistic children's books. I think we have to acknowledge to some extent that like some of this is just the way, like what it's like to be human and what's funny to, and like some of this is just our condition.
I agree. I think that there's no reason to be constantly on the lookout for things to scold.
Yeah.
But when
like try to be kind and decent and accommodating.
Of course. I just think that it's not overly prurient to say, if something could easily be swapped out for something else that's not super offensive to a little Asian boy who might be picking up the book, like that's better.
Yeah, I have maybe a religious and superstitious aversion to that. I can't make any case for it, but I do have like a strong feeling that like if it's the published work of a dead person, don't revise it. I think like in most cases it doesn't come, like in very few cases is that really the thing in question, because usually it's just like, well, this is a business decision. It's like anybody who has the power to make that decision is making it based on motives that have nothing to do with literature and if everything.
I totally agree. And the funniest part of it is when they're like, it was, and Netflix says like, we're right to make the decision because it was his son who gave us permission. But like,
son's a fucking idiot.
What does
like,
the son fucking give a shit? The son's just like collecting all the money. Like there's not
no, that means nothing. It means nothing. My mother wouldn't have wanted to offend people. Like I'm sure that's true. And like, I'm more sure that you're going to make more money with your royalties from your Agatha Christie, like whatever. Right. Like, but no, I mean, I think I guess you're not going to convince my literary heart that it's sort of like an acceptable choice to make in a vacuum when it's like solely a question of literature and feelings. I think like there's also like a few other things are true, which is like there's also value in like reading things and realizing that people talked about them differently in the past. There's also value in recognizing that like no matter how many decisions, no matter how many adjustments you made, you're never going to get to like absolute zero offense. Like, and not only that, but like it'll be different 10 years from now. Like like this is what we're focused on right now, and we're not wrong to be focused on it, but like holy shit, what's being published now is good. And like when I read the like lesbian romance that my wife loved, this recent novel, loved this and recommended it very strongly, and like it's pretty entertaining. Also, like holy shit, there is not a single mention of a man in that book that is not actively disparaging, and like that's kind of annoying to me, but like I can also read it and say like I get it, fine, like I get what the book's about and I can enjoy it well enough. But I think like you're just at a certain, like I'm not probably going to, maybe this is like what my stepfather says, which is like, well, we just need to die, like we just need to die and then the culture can change. Like I'm probably never going to feel comfortable with ChatGPT, and I'm probably never going to feel comfortable with like, let's change this book that was written with a bad prejudice. I just think like almost never is that actually the question at hand.
I agree with you. I just think that there's this weird fetishization of authors once they're dead, which I don't really want to participate in. Like,
yeah, but it's mostly a commercial.
Totally.
Yeah.
Right. But my reaction is like, I don't know, like fuck that guy. Like he was super successful and famous and his books were good. Like if his son wants to change the book, like I can still find the old book. Like I just don't.
I'm not going to actively protest it because again, like the decision being made is a business decision. So like, who's asking me for what I feel? But like, neither am I ever going to say like, this is good.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I agree. And that's, I think the core of my ambivalence, saying like, my response to this stuff is, oh, it makes sense that that's happening. You know,
like they have good reason to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Good work.
Yeah, we solved nothing, but we
solved everything.
Maybe resolved something.
Yeah, and we're not depressed anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm 3 out of 37 sessions less depressed than I was.
Yeah,
before.
You're 2.7% cured. Congratulations.
Does that seems like you're not as good at math as I briefly thought you were. Okay. Right.
No, you're like 8% cured.
Okay. That was this week's show. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. If you would like to hear the other sort of insane part of my conversation with Brian, it's sort of like a mutual therapy session on the question of being a writer. If you'd like to hear that or the rest of my conversation with Cameron or a bunch of fun solo material, then go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.